The cruelest thing about betrayal isn't the sudden heartbreak. It's the terrifying realization that the person who shattered your world left the pieces to be collected by someone who wears their exact same face. If you are excited to hear this story, please don't forget to like this video, leave a comment down below with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. Part 1: The Ghost Next Door. The first time I saw my ex-girlfriend kiss my childhood best friend, I was holding a slice of my own birthday cake. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. Harper had thrown me a surprise 25th birthday party in the loft we practically shared. I had spent the entire evening floating on a cloud of ignorant bliss, surrounded by 100 of our closest friends, drinking expensive wine and laughing until my ribs ached. Harper had been the perfect girlfriend all night, holding my hand, kissing my temple, and whispering in my ear about how much she loved me. And Zoe, my best friend Zoe, the girl who had held my hand during my father's funeral, the girl who knew my deepest fears, had been the perfect best friend, pouring my drinks and making sure I was the center of attention. The apartment was suffocatingly warm, filled with the scent of melted vanilla wax and expensive perfume. I had slipped away from the crowded living room to the kitchen to grab a napkin for the red velvet cake balancing on a paper plate in my hand. That was when the illusion of my perfect life shattered. Kitchen lights were dimmed, but the glow from the city street lamps spilled through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the two figures pressed against the marble island. Harper had her hands tangled in Zoe's dark hair, and Zoe had her arms securely wrapped around Harper's waist. They were kissing with a desperate, starving intensity, the kind of kiss that belongs behind locked doors, the kind of kiss that contains months of hidden secrets and whispered promises. My brain refused to process the image. For a fraction of a second, my mind aggressively tried to rewrite reality. I told myself it was a trick of the light. I told myself it was someone else. But I knew the silver bracelet on Harper's wrist. I had given it to her for our anniversary. And I knew the way Zoe tilted her head when she was lost in a moment. Paper plate slipped from my fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a soft, sickening splat, the red velvet cake crumbling into a ruined mess at my feet. The sound wasn't loud, but in the heavy silence of the kitchen, it was like a gunshot. Harper and Zoe broke apart, gasping for air. Zoe looked at me first, her eyes wide, her lipstick smeared across her chin. She didn't look guilty. She looked annoyed, as if I had rudely interrupted a private movie screening. Harper turned slowly. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, her expression unreadable. She didn't rush forward to apologize. She didn't fall to her knees and beg for forgiveness. She just looked at me with a heavy, exhausted sigh, as if my heartbreak was merely an inconvenience on her schedule. "Chloe," Harper started, her voice pitched in that calm, diplomatic tone she used when she was trying to manipulate a situation. "Don't make a scene. Let's talk about this like adults." Like adults? My voice trembled. I felt like the floor was tilting beneath my feet. I looked at Zoe, silently begging her to say this was a mistake, a drunken slip-up. But Zoe crossed her arms and looked away, refusing to meet my eyes. "We were going to tell you," Zoe mumbled, staring at the ruined cake on the floor. "But you've been so stressed lately, and we didn't want to ruin your birthday." "Ruin my birthday?" A hysterical, wet laugh ripped out of my throat. Tears were streaming down my face, hot and humiliating. "You're sleeping with my girlfriend in my kitchen, and you didn't want to ruin my birthday?" The murmurs from the living room had died down. The heavy, suffocating silence meant that our guests had heard. They were listening. My humiliation was a spectator sport. Harper took a step toward me, reaching out a hand. "Chloe, please. You know things haven't been working between us for a long time. You're always so needy, always clinging to me. Zoe understands me." That was the final blow. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was an assassination of my character. She was rewriting our history to make herself the victim. I took a step back, my chest heaving as I struggled to draw oxygen into my burning lungs. I wanted to scream, I wanted to break the expensive wine glasses sitting on the counter, but I was frozen, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Leave. The voice came from the shadows near the hallway. It was a voice that sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. It was sharp, authoritative, and colder than a winter storm. Out of the darkness stepped Madison. Madison was Harper's twin sister, older by exactly 4 minutes, but she might as well have been from a different species. Where Harper was warm, charismatic, and always dressed in bright, attention-grabbing colors, Madison was an iceberg. She wore a tailored black suit that looked sharper than a razor blade, her dark hair slicked back, her piercing blue eyes calculating and utterly devoid of warmth. I had only met Madison 3 times in the 2 years I had dated Harper. Madison avoided her family, ran a massive venture capital firm, and looked at people as if she were deciding whether they were worth her time to destroy. Madison didn't look at Harper or Zoe. Her icy gaze was locked onto me. She walked gracefully across the kitchen, carefully stepping over the crushed cake, and picked up my wool coat from the back of a bar stool. "Madison, don't get involved in this," Harper warned, her voice losing its calm edge. "This is between me and Chloe." Madison slowly turned her head to look at her sister. The silence that followed was suffocating. "You staged your infidelity at her birthday party in an apartment filled with 50 of your superficial friends," Madison said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it commanded the entire room. "You surrendered your right to privacy the moment you decided to be cruel instead of honest." Harper flinched. Zoe took a step back, visibly intimidated by the older twin. Madison turned back to me. She held out my coat. "Put it on, Chloe. You are not going to stand here and let them narrate your heartbreak. You are leaving, and you are leaving with your dignity." I was too numb to argue. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my arms through the sleeves. Madison didn't offer empty words of comfort. She didn't rub my back or tell me everything would be okay. Instead, she placed a firm, steady hand on the small of my back and guided me out of the kitchen, through the sea of staring, whispering guests in the living room and out the front door. She walked me down to the street where her sleek black town car was waiting in the pouring rain. Her driver opened the door, and Madison instructed him to take me to a hotel, tossing a black credit card onto the center console. Before the door closed, I looked at her. Her face, Harper's face, but sharper, older, and untainted by betrayal, was illuminated by the streetlights. "Why are you helping me?" I managed to choke out. Madison looked at me for a long, unreadable moment. The rain soaked into her expensive suit, but she didn't seem to notice. "Because my sister collects people to make herself feel powerful," Madison replied softly. "And I have a low tolerance for watching people get broken." She closed the door, and the car pulled away, leaving my old life in the rearview mirror. That was 8 months ago. 8 months of blocking numbers, changing my daily routines, and moving into a smaller, cheaper apartment on the other side of the city. I poured myself into my work as a freelance graphic designer, turning my living room into a fortress of glowing monitors and empty coffee cups. I had stopped going to the cafes Zoe and I used to frequent. I had thrown away every sweater that smelled like Harper's perfume. I had meticulously scrubbed my life clean of the past. I was surviving. I wasn't thriving, but I was breathing. I had convinced myself that the worst was over. Then came a rainy Tuesday in late October. I was dragging myself up the stairs to my 3rd-floor apartment, balancing 3 bags of groceries and a large canvas I had picked up from the art supply store. The hallway was dimly lit and smelled faintly of old carpet and bleach. My apartment building was quiet, mostly inhabited by elderly couples and college students who kept to themselves. The apartment directly next to mine, Unit 3B, had been vacant for 6 months. As I reached the landing, I noticed the heavy wooden door of 3B was propped wide open. A stack of expensive-looking, sleek black moving boxes was piled neatly in the hallway. I paused, adjusting the heavy grocery bags in my arms. New neighbor. Great. I mentally prepared myself to do the awkward neighborly nod and retreat into my cave. I just wanted to get inside, put on my oversized sweatpants, and eat stale cereal in front of my computer. Suddenly, one of the paper grocery bags ripped. A rogue lemon slipped through the bottom, bouncing onto the hardwood floor and rolling directly toward the open door of Unit 3B. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath, awkwardly shuffling forward to retrieve it before the rest of my groceries decided to make a break for it. Before I could reach down, a hand appeared in the doorway and gracefully scooped up the lemon. The hand wore a silver watch that likely cost more than my entire apartment's rent. I looked up, ready to offer a tired apology. The words died in my throat. My lungs seized, and an icy wave of pure, unfiltered panic crashed over my chest. Standing in the doorway, holding my lemon, was Harper. No, not Harper. My brain scrambled to correct the error as I stared at the woman in front of me. She wore a tailored charcoal turtleneck and black slacks. Her dark hair was loose, falling past her shoulders in an effortlessly elegant cascade. But the face, the sharp jawline, the piercing blue eyes, the slight, calculating tilt of her head, it was a face that had haunted my nightmares for 8 months. It was Madison. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain she could hear it echoing in the hallway. Why was she here? Why was the billionaire CEO sister of my cheating ex-girlfriend standing in the doorway of a run-down apartment building on the wrong side of town? Madison's gaze dropped to the torn grocery bag in my arms, then moved back up to my face. She didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, she looked terrifyingly calm, as if this was exactly what she expected. "Hello, Chloe," Madison said. Her voice was just as I remembered it, smooth, dark, and holding an undercurrent of something dangerous. "What?" My voice cracked. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to stand taller despite the heavy bags cutting into my hands. "What are you doing here?" Madison casually tossed the lemon back into one of my intact bags. She leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms over her chest. Her eyes locked onto mine, stripping away the walls I had spent 8 months building with a single searing look. "I bought the building," Madison replied smoothly. "And as of this morning, I live next door." End of part 1. Part 2, the echo of a face. "Bought the building?" My voice came out as a hollow, breathless whisper. My brain simply refused to process the sentence. I stared at the peeling wallpaper behind Madison's head, then back at her flawless, unbothered expression. It was like watching a shark swim into a dirty fishbowl and claim it was just looking for a change of scenery. "It's a transitional neighborhood," Madison said smoothly, her eyes tracking a stray can of diced tomatoes that had rolled all the way to her expensive leather loafers. "The property values are projected to increase by 20% over the next 5 years. It was a purely financial decision, Chloe. This building has a family of raccoons living in the east stairwell and a boiler that sounds like a dying banshee," I shot back, my defensive instincts overriding my shock. "You are the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. You don't live in transitional neighborhoods. You live in penthouses made of glass and imported marble." Madison didn't flinch at my sudden outburst. Instead, she crouched down gracefully, her dark slacks creasing perfectly as she began to gather the spilled contents of my grocery bags. "Perhaps I grew tired of glass," she murmured, picking up a box of chamomile tea. "Glass is fragile. It shatters when people throw things." I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my chest at the veiled reference to my birthday party. I dropped to my knees beside her, my hand shaking as I reached for a glass jar of marinara sauce that had miraculously survived the fall. "Don't," Madison said sharply. Her hand shot out, her fingers wrapping lightly around my wrist. Contact was brief, just a fraction of a second, but it sent a jolt of electricity straight up my arm. Her skin was cool, dry, and terrifyingly steady. Harper's hands were always warm, always restless, always drumming against tables or pulling at her hair. Madison's touch was like anchoring a boat in a storm. "The lid is dented," Madison explained, pulling her hand back and returning her intense gaze to the floor. The vacuum seal is broken. If you pick it up by the glass, the bottom will drop out and you will have marinara sauce embedded in your knees. I assume you don't have the energy to scrub tomato paste out of the floorboards tonight. I stared at the jar. She was right. The metal lid was slightly askew. I pulled my hand back, feeling a sudden humiliating wave of exhaustion wash over me. Why are you actually here, Madison? Madison stood, effortlessly lifting the heavy canvas grocery bags that I had been struggling with. I told you. I live in 3B. Now open your door, Chloe. Your frozen peas are going to melt and I have a conference call in 20 minutes. I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand that she leave the bags in the hallway and go back to her side of the invisible line I was drawing between us. But my arms ached, my head was pounding, and I just wanted to hide. I unlocked my door and pushed it open, stepping aside to let her in. My apartment was tiny. It was essentially one large room divided by a bookshelf, filled to the brim with half-finished canvases, graphic design monitors, wilting houseplants, and the chaotic clutter of someone who was trying to fill an empty space. It was the exact opposite of the pristine, minimalist life Harper and Madison had grown up in. Madison walked in and set the bags on my small kitchen counter. She didn't look around with disgust or pity. She didn't offer a backhanded compliment about it being cozy. She simply observed it with those calculating blue eyes, taking in the details of my survival. "Thank you," I muttered, refusing to look at her. I started unpacking the bags with aggressive speed, wanting this interaction to be over. "You bought peppermint tea instead of chamomile," Madison observed, her voice quiet behind me. "I like peppermint." "No, you don't." Madison took a step closer. I could smell her perfume, something crisp, expensive like cedarwood in cold air. Harper used to buy peppermint because she liked the smell. You prefer chamomile, specifically with a drop of honey, because the mint gives you acid reflux when you are stressed. I froze, a box of cereal clutched in my hands. Kitchen was utterly silent save for the hum of my ancient refrigerator. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. "How do you know that?" I whispered. "I never told anyone that. Harper never even knew that. She thought I drank it because I liked it." Madison's expression didn't change, but her eyes darkened slightly. "Because my sister is incredibly unobservant," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "I, on the other hand, spent 2 years watching you silently suffer through 3 cups of peppermint tea at every family holiday just to keep her happy. I noticed the way you rubbed your chest afterward. A cold, confusing feeling spread through me. It was terrifying enough that she shared the face of the woman who broke my heart. It was entirely something else to realize she had been paying attention to me in ways Harper never had. Made me feel exposed. Seen. "I don't need you to psychoanalyze my grocery shopping," I snapped, placing the cereal in the cabinet with a loud thud. "You can leave now. Have fun on your conference call." Madison tilted her head, accepting the dismissal without a fight. "Good night, Chloe," she said softly, turning toward the door. Just before she stepped out, she paused, looking back over her shoulder. "Make sure you charge your electronics. The barometer is dropping rapidly. The super mentioned this building's electrical grid fails if a heavy wind so much as looks at it." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving me alone in the sudden, suffocating quiet. I stared at the wooden door separating our apartments, my mind racing. I told myself she was just arrogant. She was a billionaire who liked to be right. I told myself that the flutter in my stomach was purely panic. Trauma misfiring in the presence of a ghost. 3 hours later, the storm hit. It wasn't just rain. It was a torrential downpour accompanied by vicious winds that rattled the old window panes of my apartment. I was sitting at my desk, wrapped in a blanket, desperately trying to finish a logo design for a client when the lights flickered, buzzed aggressively, and died. My computer screen went black. The hum of the refrigerator ceased. The apartment was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. "You have got to be kidding me," I groaned, dropping my head onto my desk. I hadn't saved the file. Course, I hadn't saved the file. I fumbled around in the dark, knocking over a cup of pens before my fingers found the cold screen of my phone. 10% battery. Perfect. Madison's warning echoed mockingly in my head. I turned on the weak flashlight feature and began rummaging through my kitchen drawers, looking for the half-melted candle I kept for emergencies. Before I could find it, a soft, rhythmic knock echoed from my front door. I froze. I crept toward the door, my heart in my throat, and looked through the peephole. The hallway was pitch black, but I could see the soft, harsh white glow of an industrial flashlight illuminating Madison's sharp jawline. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open a few inches. Yes. The power is out for the entire block, Madison said. She wasn't wearing her suit anymore. She had changed into a thick, dark gray cashmere sweater and sweatpants, her hair tied back in a messy clip. Even dressed down, she looked like she belonged on the cover of a magazine. She was holding a large, battery-powered LED lantern and a heavy thermos. I noticed, I said drily. You didn't charge your phone, did you? It wasn't a question. It's at 10%. I like to live dangerously. Madison didn't smile, but I saw the faint, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of her mouth. I have a high-capacity power bank, she said, holding up a small black box. And I made a pot of chamomile tea before the grid went down. May I come in? I should have said no. I should have told her that I was perfectly fine sitting alone in the dark, shivering in my blanket and drinking cold tap water. But the wind howled violently against the building, and the dark hallway suddenly felt incredibly lonely. I stepped back, opening the door wider. Madison walked in, bringing the warm glow of the lantern with her. She set it on my small dining table, instantly casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, placing the power bank beside my phone and plugging it in without asking. From beneath the sofa, a low, aggressive growl emerged. My cat, Barnaby, a massive, one-eyed rescue with a profound hatred for humanity, slinked out of the shadows. Barnaby had bitten Harper on 3 separate occasions. He usually hissed at anyone who came within a 5-foot radius of him. Madison paused. She didn't reach out to pet him. She simply crouched down, lowering her hand, palm up, and waited. Barnaby padded cautiously toward her. He sniffed her fingers, let out a tiny inquisitive chirp, and to my absolute horror, rubbed his head against her knuckles, purring loudly. Traitor, I whispered, staring in disbelief. He just appreciates someone who understands boundaries, Madison replied, her voice soft as she gave Barnaby one single scratch behind his good ear before standing back up. She unscrewed the top of the thermos, pouring a steaming cup of tea into the lid, and handed it to me. The rich, calming scent of chamomile and honey filled the cold air. Our fingers brushed as I took the cup, and this time the spark felt less like static shock and more like a slow burn. Why are you doing this? I asked, wrapping both hands around the warm cup. You could be in a 5-star hotel downtown right now where they have backup generators. Madison looked around my dim apartment, her eyes lingering on the canvases stacked against the wall. When she finally looked back at me, the shadows from the lantern made her eyes look almost black. Because Chloe, Madison said, her voice dropping into a register that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, I spent 2 years watching someone take you for granted. Now that you are finally free, I find myself deeply invested in making sure you stay that way. She stepped closer, the scent of cedar washing over me again. I didn't move into this building for the real estate. I moved here because you are terrible at taking care of yourself when you are grieving, and I was tired of watching from a distance. The air between us suddenly felt impossibly thin. I couldn't look away from her. The woman who wore the face of my nightmare was standing in my dark living room, slowly, methodically tearing down every defense I had left. End of Part 2. Part 3, the wall between us. The air in my apartment had grown so thin I felt lightheaded. Madison's confession hung in the dark space between us, illuminated only by the harsh, artificial glow of the LED lantern. I moved here because you are terrible at taking care of yourself when you are grieving, and I was tired of watching from a distance. I stared at her, my fingers tightening around the warm mug of chamomile tea. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, loud enough that I was sure she could hear it over the howling wind outside. It was a terrifying thing to have the face of the woman who destroyed you standing in your living room, saying the things you had always begged to hear, but in a voice that belonged to a stranger. "I am not a project, Madison," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling but laced with defensive anger. "I am not a failing startup you can acquire and restructure. I don't need a billionaire savior with a guilt complex coming down from her penthouse to pity the poor, broken graphic designer." Madison didn't flinch. She absorbed my anger the way a deep ocean absorbs a thrown stone, without a single ripple. "I don't pity you, Chloe," she said, her voice smooth and frighteningly even. "Pity is for people who have surrendered. You are surviving. I am simply observing that your survival strategy is exhausting." She took a slow step backward, deliberately putting physical distance between us to ease the invisible pressure in the room. "And I don't acquire things that are broken. I only invest in things that have value. You forgot your own value the moment my sister convinced you that you were hard to love." The words hit me like a physical blow. They were too precise, cutting straight through the scar tissue I had spent 8 months building. My breath hitched, and for a terrifying second I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. I refused to cry in front of her. I refused to let another woman with those piercing blue eyes see me break. "You need to leave," I whispered, looking down at the wooden floorboards. Madison didn't argue. She didn't try to justify her presence or push me into a corner. She simply nodded. "The power bank is fully charged. Your phone is at 11%. Keep the lantern on the lowest setting. The batteries will last until morning." She walked to the door, opening it to the pitch-black hallway. "Good night, Chloe." She stepped out, pulling the heavy door shut behind her with a soft click. I was left alone in the dim light, the scent of cedarwood lingering in the cold air, holding a cup of tea that tasted exactly the way I liked it. For the next 3 weeks, Madison became a ghost. She was the perfect neighbor in the most infuriating way possible. I never ran into her in the hallway. I never heard her slam her door. She didn't knock, she didn't leave cryptic notes, and she certainly didn't ambush me with any more life-altering confessions. It was as if she had drawn an invisible line down the center of our shared wall and respected my boundaries with militaristic precision. But I knew she was there. I became hyper-aware of her presence on the other side of the drywall. At night, when the city traffic died down and my apartment settled into a heavy quiet, I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of her life. I heard the low, steady murmur of her voice on late-night international conference calls. I heard the soft click of her deadbolt at exactly 6 a.m. when she left for her morning run. And then there was the piano. I didn't know Madison played, but one Tuesday evening, as I was hunched over my drawing tablet rubbing my aching temples, the sound drifted through the wall. It wasn't a digital keyboard, it was the rich, acoustic resonance of a baby grand. She didn't play upbeat pop songs or simple melodies. She played complex, dark classical pieces, Chopin, Rachmaninoff. The music was disciplined but saturated with a quiet, overwhelming longing. I found myself resting my forehead against the cool drywall, closing my eyes and letting her music untangle the knots in my chest. I hated that I looked forward to it. I hated that I found myself lingering by my peephole when I heard her footsteps. My brain was constantly fighting a war between trauma and undeniable intrigue. Every time I pictured her, my mind immediately flashed to Harper, bringing a wave of nausea. But then I would remember Madison's steady hands, her cold logic, her devastating honesty, and the nausea would shift into a heavy, burning heat in the pit of my stomach. The uneasy truce broke on a freezing Thursday afternoon in November. I was working against a brutal deadline, trying to manually cut a thick stack of rigid mat boards for a gallery presentation. My hands were cramping, my eyes were burning from staring at the screen all day, and I was running purely on stale coffee and anxiety. I grabbed my heavy-duty X-Acto knife, pressing down hard on the metal ruler to slice through the final board. But my grip slipped. The razor-sharp blade skipped off the edge of the metal ruler and sliced diagonally across the fleshy part of my left palm. I gasped, dropping the knife onto the desk with a sharp clatter. For a split second, there was no pain, just a cold, shocking pressure. Then the blood welled up. Fast. "Oh God," I choked out, clutching my wrist. Cut was deep, much deeper than a simple paper cut. Bright red blood was already dripping down my fingers, splattering onto the pristine white mat boards and the hardwood floor. I clamped my right hand over the wound, applying pressure as a wave of intense dizziness washed over me. I stumbled toward my tiny bathroom, leaving a trail of red droplets. I frantically kicked open the cabinet beneath the sink with my foot, searching for the first aid kit, but it wasn't there. I had used the last of the gauze a month ago and forgot to replace it. Pain hit me then, a sharp, throbbing burn that made my knees buckle slightly. The blood was soaking through my fingers, running down my forearm. I didn't have a choice. I staggered out of my apartment, kicking the door open, and practically fell across the hallway to Unit 3B. I didn't knock. I hammered my bloody fist against the heavy wood, leaving a faint crimson smear on the polished surface. "Madison!" I yelled, my voice cracking with panic. The door swung open almost instantly, as if she had been standing right behind it. Madison was wearing a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to her elbows and dark trousers, a Bluetooth earpiece resting in one ear. She took one look at my pale face and the blood dripping onto her welcome mat. "Call you back," Madison said coldly into her earpiece, pulling it out and tossing it onto a sleek console table. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask me what stupid thing I had done. She simply stepped forward, grasped my uninjured wrist with terrifying strength, and pulled me into her apartment. "Kitchen!" "Now," she ordered. Her apartment was breathtaking, minimalist, sprawling, filled with dark leather, steel accents, and the massive black Steinway piano I had heard through the walls. But I was too dizzy to admire the architecture. Madison guided me to the massive marble kitchen island and gently forced me to sit on a tall velvet stool. She moved with ruthless efficiency, disappearing into the bathroom and returning seconds later with a large, fully stocked medical kit. "Let me see," she commanded, stepping between my knees to get closer. I hesitated, trembling as I slowly pulled my right hand away from the cut. The wound was ugly, deep, and bleeding aggressively. When Harper and I had been dating, I had once accidentally burned my arm on the stove. Harper had freaked out, complaining that the smell of burnt skin made her nauseous, and left me to bandage it myself while she went to the balcony to get fresh air. Madison didn't flinch. She gently took my bloody hand in both of hers. Her touch was incredibly careful, a stark contrast to the sharp, commanding tone she used to speak to the world. "It's deep, but you haven't hit an artery or a major tendon," she analyzed quietly, her icy blue eyes focused entirely on my palm. "I don't think it requires stitches, but we need to stop the bleeding and sanitize it immediately. This is going to sting, Chloe." Look at me, not the hand. I forced my eyes up. I looked at her face. So close I could see the faint silvery scar just below her left eyebrow, a detail Harper didn't have. I could see the tiny gold flecks hidden in her deep blue irises. She poured an antiseptic solution directly over the open wound. A sharp, blinding pain shot up my arm. I gasped, my whole body tensing, and my free hand instinctively shot out, grabbing a fistful of her expensive white shirt to anchor myself. "I know," Madison murmured, her voice dropping to a low, soothing hum that vibrated in the small space between us. "Breathe. I've got you." She quickly pressed a thick square of sterile gauze against the cut, applying firm, even pressure. Her thumbs rubbed slow, calming circles against the back of my hand. I was panting slightly, the adrenaline crashing, leaving me weak and violently aware of how close we were standing. I was sitting on the stool, and she was standing between my parted knees. Her crisp white shirt was now stained with my blood where my right hand was still tightly gripping the fabric. "I ruined your shirt," I whispered breathlessly, staring at the red smear on her waist. Madison didn't look down. Her eyes remained locked on mine, dark and completely unguarded. "I own other shirts." The silence in the kitchen expanded, swallowing the sounds of the city outside. Pain in my hand was fading into a dull throb, completely overshadowed by the sudden, suffocating heat radiating from the woman standing so intimately close to me. "You didn't have to fix this," I said softly, my voice barely more than a vibration in the air. Madison's jaw tightened. She carefully began wrapping a white medical bandage around my palm, securing it with precision. When she finished, she didn't step back. She kept her hands resting lightly on my wrists. "I told you, Chloe," Madison said, her eyes tracing the line of my jaw before meeting my gaze again. "I have a very low tolerance for watching people get broken. Especially you." For the first time since I met her, the ghost of her sister completely vanished. I wasn't looking at Harper's twin. I was looking at Madison. And as my heart slammed wildly against my ribs, I realized with terrifying clarity that I didn't want her to step back. End of Part 3. Part 4, The Architecture of a Voice. I was the first to break. The heat radiating between us in that pristine marble kitchen was suffocating, burning away the last of my rational defenses. My hand was still gripping the blood-stained fabric of Madison's crisp white shirt, my knuckles white with the force of it. For one terrifying, suspended second, I thought about pulling her closer. I thought about what it would feel like to bridge the impossible gap between us, to let myself be anchored by a woman who felt like a storm dressed in custom tailoring. Instead, I let go. I dropped my hand as if the fabric had caught fire, stumbling a half-step backward. The velvet stool scraped loudly against the marble floor, a harsh, ugly sound that shattered the delicate intimacy of the moment. Madison didn't flinch, but I saw the immediate, calculated locking of her jaw. The raw, unguarded darkness in her blue eyes vanished, instantly replaced by the cool, impenetrable wall of the CEO. She took a deliberate step back, giving me the oxygen I was suddenly desperate for. "Keep the bandage dry for the next 24 hours, Madison said, her voice completely devoid of the low, vibrating warmth from a moment ago. She turned her back to me, walking over to the sink to wash my blood from her hands. "I will leave a fresh roll of gauze outside your door tomorrow morning. Do not attempt to use the X-Acto knife until the skin knits." "I thank you for patching me up," I stammered, my heart still beating a frantic, humiliating rhythm against my ribs. I cradled my bandaged hand against my chest, suddenly feeling terribly small in her sprawling, expensive apartment. "It was basic first aid, Chloe. Good night." She didn't look at me as I practically fled her apartment, slipping back into the chaotic safety of my own dimly lit living room. I locked my deadbolt and leaned against the door, sliding down until I hit the floor. I pressed the heels of my hands against my burning eyes. I was losing my mind. I was falling for the gravity of a woman who wore the face of my greatest betrayal, and I had absolutely no idea how to stop it. The next morning, there was a small, matte black box sitting perfectly centered on my welcome mat. It wasn't just gauze. Inside the box was a high-grade medical silicone compression glove designed specifically for artists with wrist and palm injuries, along with a custom ergonomic grip for my digital drawing pen. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was a terrifyingly practical, intensely thoughtful gesture that whispered of a quiet, obsessive observation. It said, "I know what you need to keep working, and I will not let you fail." I wore the glove. I told myself it was just because I had a deadline, but the pressure against my healing palm felt like a phantom touch, a constant reminder of the woman next door. 3 days later, I had the most important pitch of my freelance career. Before my world had imploded, I had submitted a proposal to rebrand and redesign the visual identity of the Haven Community Center, a massive nonprofit that provided safe spaces, job training, and resources for vulnerable women in the city. I had poured my soul into the designs, creating a visual language that felt warm, empowering, and deeply safe. The meeting was held in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom in the financial district. I arrived early, my injured hand tucked into the pocket of my slacks, feeling slightly out of place in my thrifted blazer among the sea of $1,000 suits. The board consisted of 5 people, but the man running the show was Richard Vance, a prominent real estate developer and the primary financial backer of the center. Richard was the kind of man who wore too much cologne, interrupted people as a sport, and looked at my portfolio as if it were a child's finger painting. I was 10 minutes into my presentation, projecting my designs onto the massive screen, when the heavy boardroom doors swung open. My breath caught in my throat. Madison walked in. She wore a devastatingly sharp navy blue suit, a silk silver blouse, and an expression that could freeze boiling water. The entire room seemed to immediately recalibrate around her presence. Even Richard sat up straighter, his arrogant smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. "Miss Sterling," Richard said, his voice dripping with sudden sycophantic respect. "We weren't expecting Vanguard Capital to send their CEO for a simple branding pitch." "Vanguard is underwriting 50% of this project, Richard," Madison replied, her tone terrifyingly smooth as she pulled out a leather chair at the far end of the long mahogany table. She didn't even glance at me. "I prefer to know exactly whose vision I am funding. Continue, Miss Evans." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I tried to find my rhythm again, gesturing to the warm, terracotta and deep sage color palettes I had chosen for the center's interior murals and digital interfaces. "The goal here is psychological safety," I explained, clicking to the next slide. "We want the visual identity to feel grounded. People walking into the Haven Center are often in states of extreme crisis. Harsh corporate blues and sterile whites can feel institutional and intimidating. By utilizing—" "Yeah, that's all very touching, sweetheart," Richard interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. He leaned back in his chair, clicking his pen loudly. "But this is a multi-million-dollar facility, not a yoga studio. We need the branding to look premium. Elite. We want donors to see our logo and think prestige, not soft. Change the primary colors to slate gray and royal blue and sharpen the typography. Make it aggressive." I felt the old familiar weight of humiliation settle in my chest. When I was with Harper, I had learned to shrink in moments like this. Harper would have agreed with Richard. Harper would have told me to stop being so sensitive and just take the money. I lowered my hand, my shoulders unconsciously dropping as I prepared to concede. "Do you have a background in environmental psychology, Richard?" The voice cut through the room like a silver blade. Everyone froze. Madison had set her pen down on the table. The small click echoed loudly in the silent room. She was looking at Richard with an expression of such cold, calculated disdain that I actually felt a spike of pity for the man. Excuse me?" Richard stammered, a dull flush creeping up his neck. "I asked if you possess a degree in environmental psychology," Madison repeated, leaning forward slightly, her blue eyes pinning him to his chair. "'Cause Miss Evans does not need this branding to look elite for your golf buddies. Do you know why she chose terracotta and sage?" Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "Because terracotta mimics the warmth of a hearth," Madison continued, her voice dangerously quiet but filling every corner of the room. "And sage lowers cortisol levels in the human brain by 14% upon initial visual contact. Do you know why she rounded the edges of the primary logo? Aesthetic preference?" Richard managed to choke out. "Because sharp geometric angles subliminally signal threat and aggression to individuals suffering from PTSD," Madison stated, never breaking eye contact with him. "The women walking through those doors are escaping violence. You want to greet them with branding that looks aggressive so you can feel important at a gala." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Madison finally shifted her gaze away from Richard, looking down the long table until her eyes locked onto mine. The ice in her expression melted into something completely different, something fiercely protective, something that felt like a shield being raised explicitly in my defense. "You have interrupted the only person in this room who is treating these women as human beings rather than statistics, Richard," Madison said softly, though the authority in her voice was absolute. Miss Evans will retain complete creative control over this project, and Vanguard Capital will double our initial funding to ensure her designs are implemented exactly as pitched. If you have a problem with that, you can take your checkbook and leave. Richard swallowed heavily, his face pale. No problem at all, Madison. We trust her vision. Good. Madison stood up, buttoning her navy jacket with sharp precision. You may finish your presentation, Chloe. I have heard enough to know my money is in the right hands. She left the room before I could even process what had just happened. I finished the pitch in a daze. The board members, thoroughly terrified of crossing Madison, practically threw their approval at me. When I finally packed up my portfolio and took the elevator down to the lobby, my hands were shaking, not from fear but from a dizzying, intoxicating rush of adrenaline. I pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped out into the damp city air. It had started to rain, a cold, persistent drizzle that slicked the pavement. Madison was standing under the massive black awning of the building, her hands tucked into the pockets of her trousers, watching the traffic slide past. She looked like a shadow against the gray city, untamed and deeply solitary. I walked up to her, my heart thumping wildly. "You didn't have to do that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper over the sound of the rain. Madison didn't look at me right away. She kept her eyes on the street. "I know. You are perfectly capable of defending yourself, Chloe." "Then why did you?" She finally turned her head. The damp air had caused a few dark strands of hair to escape her immaculate styling, framing her sharp jawline. "Because there is a profound difference between being capable of fighting for your voice and having someone clear the room so you don't have to," she said quietly. "Harper took your voice. I am simply making sure you have the space to use it again." I stared at her, the traffic and the rain fading into meaningless background noise. "You memorized my entire design philosophy. I pay attention to things that matter." Madison. I took a step closer, crossing the invisible boundary she had set 3 weeks ago. The scent of rain and cedar wrapped around me. I looked up into her eyes, searching for the ghost of her sister and finding absolutely nothing but the woman standing in front of me. "If you keep defending me like this, if you keep looking at me like this, I'm going to misinterpret it." Madison's breath hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible break in her flawless armor. She looked down at my mouth, her eyes darkening, a heavy, magnetic pull settling in the few inches of air between us. "What if," Madison murmured, her voice dropping into a rough, devastating whisper, "you aren't misinterpreting anything at all?" End of Part 4. Part 5, The Geography of an Open Door. The rain continued to fall, turning the city streets into mirrors of fractured silver light. "What if you aren't misinterpreting anything at all?" Madison's words hung in the damp air, heavier than the rain, more dangerous than the storm. I stared up at her, my heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. Her blue eyes were entirely focused on me, stripped of the corporate armor she wore so easily in front of the rest of the world. For a fleeting, reckless second, I wanted to close the final few inches between us. I wanted to grab the lapels of her custom suit and pull her down to my level, just to see what would happen if the storm broke. But I was terrified. Harper had taught me that love was a trapdoor, and I was still bleeding from the fall. Madison saw the hesitation in my eyes. She didn't push. She didn't demand an answer. She simply took a slow, agonizing breath, the walls sliding back into place, and raised her hand to flag down a passing town car. The ride back to our building was enveloped in a charged, heavy silence. We sat in the back seat, close enough that the damp wool of her coat brushed against my thrifted blazer, but neither of us spoke. We were two women circling a fire, desperately wanting the warmth but terrified of the burn. When we reached our floor, Madison walked me to my door. She waited until my key was in the lock before she spoke. "I am not my sister, Chloe," she said quietly to my back. I turned around. The dim hallway light cast shadows across the sharp angles of her face. "I know," I whispered. "That's exactly what terrifies me." I went inside and closed the door. But something fundamental had shifted. The invisible wall I had constructed between 3A and 3B had cracked. Over the next 3 weeks, the geography of our hallway changed. Began with the doors. I was working late on a Thursday night, the apartment stuffy and smelling faintly of turpentine. Without thinking, I unlatched my front door and cracked it open a few inches to let the cross breeze in. 10 minutes later, I heard the distinct, heavy click of Madison's deadbolt unlocking. Her door swung open, propped wide by a heavy iron bookend. We didn't say anything to each other. We just let the space between us breathe. By the end of the week, the hallway had become a neutral country. Barnaby, my fiercely antisocial one-eyed cat, abandoned his post on my sofa and began sprawling out perfectly in the center of the threshold between our open doors, acting as a furry border guard. The silence between us slowly morphed into a quiet, late-night language. When Madison's board meetings ran until midnight, I started making an extra cup of chamomile tea and leaving it on the small table in the hall. In return, I would wake up to find fresh pastries from a bakery 3 miles away sitting on a napkin by my door, placed there right after her morning run. We started talking. Not across the hallway, but sitting in it. One evening in early December, the radiator in the building was working overtime, making the apartments uncomfortably warm. We found ourselves sitting on the floor in the hallway, leaning against our respective door frames, separated only by 4 feet of worn carpet and Barnaby's sleeping form. I told her about my father, about how he had insisted that art was a hobby, not a career, and how his lack of faith had fueled my entire freelance business. Madison listened with an intensity that made me feel entirely known. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She simply said, "Your father sounds like a man who deserves bad coffee for the rest of his life." I laughed, a real, unforced sound that echoed in the stairwell. He deserves worse, but bad coffee is a start. I looked across the hallway at her. She was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and loose linen pants, her bare feet resting on the carpet. She looked softer, younger. "I heard you playing the piano," I said softly. Madison went still. Her fingers, which had been gently tracing the edge of her coffee mug, stopped moving. I try to keep the volume down. "Don't. It's beautiful. You play Rachmaninoff like you're angry at him." A small, genuine smile touched the corner of her mouth. "I am angry at him. He wrote chords that require a wingspan." She looked down into her mug. "I used to write my own compositions. Years ago. Why did you stop?" The silence stretched for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was completely devoid of emotion, which was how I knew it hurt. "Because I played an original piece at a family gathering when I was 16, Madison said, staring at the floorboards. Harper was jealous of the attention. She told our parents that the music sounded depressing, that it was embarrassing her in front of her friends. My father told me to stick to the classics. He said original emotion was messy, and the Sterling family didn't do messy." A hot spark of anger flared in my chest. I knew that specific brand of cruelty. Harper collected the things you loved and used them as collateral. "Harper is a coward," I said fiercely. "And your father is an idiot. You shouldn't have stopped playing your own music just because they were too small to understand it." Madison's eyes slowly rose to meet mine. The air in the hallway suddenly grew heavy, charged with the same electric tension from the night in the rain. She looked at me not as a neighbor, and not as a project, but as a woman who had just been handed a key to a locked room. She stood up. I held my breath as she crossed the neutral territory. She didn't stop until she was standing in my doorway, looking down at me where I sat on the floor. "Maybe I should start playing them again," she murmured. "Maybe you should," I whispered, tilting my head back to look up at her. Madison dropped to one knee, bringing herself to my eye level. The scent of cedar and rain washed over me. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then lifted back to my eyes, asking a silent question. My heart slammed against my ribs. I leaned in just a fraction of an inch, my eyes fluttering shut. "Ring. Ring. Ring." The shrill, piercing sound of a cell phone shattered the quiet. Madison flinched, pulling back instantly. The spell broke. Cold air rushed back into the space between us. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen cast a harsh white glare against her face. I didn't need to read the caller ID. I could see the immediate hardening of her jaw, the way the soft, vulnerable woman from 3 seconds ago vanished, replaced by the iceberg. "It's Harper," Madison said, her voice dropping to a glacial chill. My stomach plummeted. Just hearing her name was a physical blow. The old ghosts rushed back into the hallway, crowding the space, bringing the smell of red velvet cake and the echo of Zoe's laughter. "Don't answer it," I pleaded quietly. But Madison's thumb had already hovered over the green button. "She's been calling the firm all day. If I don't answer, she will show up in the lobby." She pressed accept, and perhaps to prove she had nothing to hide, tapped the speaker icon. "Are you with her?" Harper's voice filled the hallway. It was exactly as I remembered it, smooth, demanding, and dripping with an unearned sense of superiority. Madison didn't bat an eye. "Good evening to you too, Harper." "Don't play games with me, Madison. Zoe saw you two leaving the Vanguard building together last week. What are you doing? Are you trying to humiliate me?" "Zoe should find a hobby that doesn't involve stalking women she betrayed," Madison replied coldly. "And my life does not revolve around humiliating you. You managed to do that perfectly well on your own." Harper let out a brittle, cruel laugh. "You moved next door to my ex-girlfriend. You don't get to pretend this is a coincidence. Is she your new charity case? Is that what she is now?" I flinched. The words hit exactly where they were designed to. Madison's eyes flashed with a dark, terrifying fury. She looked at me, her expression softening in a desperate plea for me to ignore it, but her voice remained razor-sharp. "Say her name with respect, or do not say it at all." "Oh, please," Harper sneered through the speaker. "I know Chloe. She loves a savior. She loves being defended because it makes her feel important. She's confusing your guilt with love, Madison. And you're just collecting another broken thing so you can feel superior. It's what you do." The air in my lungs turned to ash. It was my deepest, darkest fear, dragged out into the light and spoken in the voice of the woman who broke me. Was Harper right? Was I just a project? Was Madison only here because she felt guilty for her sister's cruelty? "That is enough," Madison hissed, her thumb moving to end the call. "You don't know her," Harper yelled, her voice frantic. "You know the sad, pathetic version she performs after getting hurt. I had the real one." Madison smiled, but it was a terrifying, violent expression. "No, Harper. You had access. You mistook it for possession." She ended the call. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sat frozen on the floor, staring at the carpet. The warmth of the evening was completely gone. "Chloe," Madison started, stepping toward me. "Don't." I scrambled to my feet, backing into my apartment. My chest was heaving. The ghost of Harper was standing between us, grinning. "She's not entirely wrong, is she?" Madison stopped dead in her tracks. Pain flickered across her face, raw and visible. "Which part?" "The part about you collecting broken things. The part about me confusing gratitude with whatever this is." I pointed a shaking finger between us. "You fix my X-Acto knife cuts. You buy me ergonomic gloves. You defend me in boardrooms. You swoop in and fix the broken girl. I am not fixing you. I am standing beside you." "I need space," I blurted out, the panic taking full control. "I need you to step back, Madison. I can't do this. I don't know if you're looking at me, or if you're just looking at the mess your sister left behind." Madison stood in the doorway. She didn't argue. She didn't tell me I was being irrational. She absorbed the blow with the tragic, practiced grace of a woman who was used to being pushed away. How much space? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Enough that I stop waiting to hear your keys in the lock. Madison closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. When she opened them, the wall was fully constructed. There was no warmth left. All right. She turned around, walked into her apartment, and closed the door. The heavy, metallic slide of the deadbolt locking echoed in the empty hallway like a gunshot. End of Part 5. Part 6, The Weight of Empty Space. For the next 2 weeks, I got exactly what I had asked for. Madison gave me space with the same ruthless, terrifying efficiency she applied to corporate acquisitions. The invisible wall I had asked her to step behind was instantly reinforced with steel and concrete. She became the perfect, non-existent neighbor. There were no more soft knocks on the door. There was no more chamomile tea left on the hallway table. Her heavy oak door remained firmly shut, the deadbolt locked. Even the music stopped. I spent hours sitting at my desk, staring blindly at my glowing monitors, straining my ears to hear the muffled, beautiful anger of her Rachmaninoff through the drywall. But there was nothing. Only the heavy, suffocating silence of an old building in the dead of winter. It was agonizing. I had thought that pushing her away would bring me clarity. I had thought it would prove to me that I was healing, that I could stand on my own 2 feet without needing someone else to anchor me. But the silence didn't feel like independence. Felt like a punishment. Barnaby, my usually vicious rescue cat, seemed to share my misery. Every evening, right around the time Madison usually returned from her office, Barnaby would march out into the hallway, sit exactly on the invisible border between our doors, and let out a long, mournful yowl. It was as if he were publicly shaming me for my diplomatic failures. "She's not coming out, buddy," I whispered one night, scooping him up from the carpet. He grumbled, swatting lazily at my chin before burying his face in my sweater. The hardest part was the realization that hit me on the 5th day of her absence. Harper had never given me space. When Harper and I fought, she would crowd me. She would text me 50 times, show up at my favorite coffee shop, and demand my attention until I caved, exhausted by her relentless need to control the narrative. Harper ignored my boundaries because she viewed them as challenges. Madison respected my boundaries like they were constitutional law. I had asked her to step back, and she had done it instantly, swallowing her own feelings, her own desire to fix things just to ensure I felt safe. She wasn't Harper. She had never been Harper. And in my desperate attempt to protect myself from a ghost, I had alienated the first real, solid thing I had found in months. Desperate to prove to myself that I was fine, that I could want normal, uncomplicated things, I agreed to go on a date. Her name was Sarah. She was a ceramicist I had met through a mutual friend at an art supply store. Sarah was lovely. She wore oversized knit sweaters, had warm brown eyes, and possessed a laugh that contained absolutely zero historical trauma. She didn't share a face with my cheating ex-girlfriend. She didn't own a venture capital firm. She was simple, sweet, and safe. We went to a small, dimly lit wine bar downtown. Sarah talked passionately about clay collapsing in the kiln and asked polite, careful questions about my graphic design work. I smiled. I nodded. I drank my Pinot Noir. But I wasn't there. Every time Sarah tilted her head, I thought about the sharp, calculating way Madison analyzed a room. When Sarah accidentally brushed her knee against mine under the table, I felt a mild warmth, but I didn't feel the terrifying electric jolt that accompanied Madison's lightest touch. I realized, with a sinking feeling of dread, that safe was no longer what I wanted. I wanted the storm. I wanted the woman who made my heart pound so hard it bruised my ribs. When Sarah walked me back to my apartment building, the damp winter wind biting at our cheeks, she turned to me under the glow of the street lamp and gently touched my sleeve. "I had a really nice time, Chloe," she said softly, leaning in slightly. I stepped back before I could stop myself. The movement was small but undeniable. Sarah paused, a knowing, slightly sad smile touching her lips. She let her hand fall away. "There's someone else, isn't there?" It's complicated," I murmured, wrapping my scarf tighter around my neck, feeling a wave of guilt. There shouldn't be. But there is. That is not the same as a no, Sarah said kindly. Take care of yourself, Chloe. She walked away into the night, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk, entirely consumed by the thought of the woman waiting on the third floor. The following morning, I took the elevator down to the lobby to check my mail, only to find my heart dropping straight into my stomach. Madison was standing in the center of the lobby, surrounded by 3 massive, reinforced wooden moving crates. She was wearing a thick black turtleneck and dark jeans, her hair pinned up in a messy clip, a clipboard in her hand. 2 burly movers were carefully strapping one of the crates onto a heavy-duty dolly. The air left my lungs. For one unbearable, blinding moment, I thought she was leaving. I thought she had taken my request for space and, in her terrifyingly literal way, decided to put a different zip code between us. The sheer, overwhelming panic that ripped through my chest was all the proof I needed. I didn't want space. I wanted her. You're moving. The words tumbled out of my mouth, breathless and terrified, before I could stop them. Madison turned around. Her eyes swept over me, a quick, hungry glance that she immediately locked away behind a wall of pure ice. No, Madison replied, her voice cool and formal. The crates are for the Vanguard Foundation charity auction this weekend. We are transporting the silent auction items to the venue. Oh. I let out a shaky breath, trying to recover my dignity. It was practically non-existent at this point. Good. Not good. Neutral. The auction is a wonderful cause. Madison's eyebrow arched slightly. Very articulate. I have many gifts. One of the movers carrying a heavy box accidentally bumped into my shoulder as he passed. I stumbled slightly on the slick marble floor. Madison reached out instantly, her hand catching my elbow to steady me. Contact lasted less than a second, but it sent a shockwave straight to my core. Every disciplined, rational part of my brain short-circuited. She let go immediately, her jaw clenching. Sorry, she muttered, stepping back. Don't be, I said quickly. The words were rushing out of me, desperate to fill the space she kept trying to create. We stood in the bright, fluorescent light of the lobby, surrounded by chaos and moving boxes, both of us apparently incapable of speaking like normal human beings. Finally, I blurted out the one thing that was guaranteed to break the ice. I went on a date last night. Madison's entire body went deathly still. Clipboard in her hand lowered slowly. The wall she had built didn't just crack, it shattered. I see. It was nice, I lied. Good, Madison said, though she looked as if she were politely swallowing ground glass. You say that like it physically pains you, I noted, my pulse racing. Her eyes sharpened, the icy blue turning into a dark, stormy ocean. What do you want me to say, Chloe? The question wasn't angry, it was exhausted. It was deeply, achingly human. I realized then just how much restraint she had been exercising for the last 2 weeks, how carefully she had folded herself into a smaller shape just so I wouldn't feel cornered. I don't know, I admitted, my voice dropping to a whisper. Maybe something unfair. Madison looked away, staring at the polished marble floor for a long moment. When she finally looked back at me, the raw intensity in her gaze made me shiver. All right, she said quietly. I hated it. I hated sitting in my apartment, imagining someone else learning how you tilt your head when you're trying to figure out a design flaw. I hated the thought of someone making you tea and not knowing that you leave the spoon in the mug because the clinking sound comforts you. I hated myself for hating it because you asked for space and you owe me absolutely nothing. Is that unfair enough for you? All the air vanished from the lobby. My heart was beating so loudly I was certain the movers could hear it. Yes, I breathed, my eyes shining. That was very unfair. Good. I am practicing imperfection. A small, breathless laugh escaped me, breaking at the edges. Madison took a half-step closer. She was always stopping, always asking for permission without using words. I wanted to close the distance. I wanted to grab the lapels of her black turtleneck and tell her I didn't want the space anymore. But before either of us could move, the heavy glass doors of the building slid open. There are people who enter a room and bring light. Harper entered a room and expected everyone to immediately arrange themselves around her like stage props. She walked in wearing a pristine white cashmere coat, looking like a picture of radiant innocence. Behind her, trailing like a shadow, was Zoe. Zoe looked thinner, more tired, her eyes darting nervously around the lobby. "Well," Harper said, her voice echoing loudly, cutting through the heavy tension between Madison and me. "Isn't this cozy?" Madison's expression instantly closed, transforming back into the impenetrable CEO. She stepped slightly in front of me, shielding me. "Leave, Harper. This is a private residential building. You are not a guest." Harper rolled her eyes, stepping deeper into the lobby. "Oh, please. Can we talk without you performing armed security, Madison? I'm here to see Chloe." A month ago, my stomach would have dropped. I would have let Madison handle it, shrinking into the background, terrified of Harper's sharp tongue. But as I looked at the woman who had shattered my heart, I realized something incredible. I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel devastated. I just felt tired. "No," I said, my voice steady and clear. Zoe flinched as if I had struck her. Harper's confident smirk faltered. "Chloe, come on," Harper said, softening her voice to that manipulative, sweet tone she used to use to get her way. "You used to be kinder than this." "I used to be easier to interrupt," I shot back, stepping out from behind Madison so I was standing directly beside her. People often confuse the two. Madison's gaze flicked to me, and I saw a flicker of pure, unadulterated pride soften the hard line of her mouth. Harper saw it too, and for the first time she didn't look annoyed. She looked genuinely afraid. "You're really doing this?" Harper sneered, turning her venom onto her sister. "You're playing house with my leftovers?" Madison's eyes went dark, but before she could speak, I took a step forward. "Don't talk to her like that," I snapped, the heat rising in my chest. I wasn't just defending myself anymore, I was defending the woman next to me. If Madison has guilt, she carries it honestly. You just turn yours into confetti and throw it on everyone else to mask the stench of your own selfishness. Harper's mouth dropped open. Zoe let out a tiny gasp. "You have 2 minutes to leave before I have building security escort you out," Madison added smoothly, her shoulder brushing against mine. Contact was deliberate, grounding, and absolutely terrifying to Harper. "You would choose her over me?" Harper demanded, her voice bordering on a screech. Madison looked at her twin for a long, silent moment. They shared the same face, the same eyes, the same DNA, but they could not have been more fundamentally different. "I am choosing myself over cleaning up after your messes," Madison said with chilling finality. "And Chloe is choosing herself too. You are simply unused to rooms where neither of us revolves around you." Harper stared at us, her face flushed with a mixture of rage and humiliation. Because she thrived on an audience that adored her, and this audience had just definitively turned its back. She spun on her heel and stormed out of the glass doors. Zoe followed quietly, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. When the doors slid shut behind them, a profound silence descended on the lobby. I didn't feel the sharp spike of victory. Victory implied a battle, and I was done fighting a war that had ended 8 months ago. What I felt was space. Real, breathable space. Air entering a room that had been sealed shut for far too long. Madison slowly turned to face me. The icy armor had vanished completely, leaving only the soft, careful woman I had spent the last 2 weeks desperately missing. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. I took a deep breath, looking into her eyes. "No," I said, a genuine smile breaking across my face. "But I'm not destroyed either." End of Part 6. Part 7, The Geometry of Trust. The lobby confrontation didn't magically cure my trauma, but it did change the air pressure in my life. For the first time in 8 months, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. Harper had taken her spotlight and left, and in the quiet space she left behind, Madison and I began to figure out what we were to each other. It wasn't a seamless transition. My fear didn't announce itself with dramatic flair anymore. It returned in ordinary, quiet moments when I least expected it. It happened on a lazy Sunday afternoon. Madison was standing in my kitchen, leaning over the sink to wash a colander of fresh strawberries she had brought from the farmer's market. The pale winter sunlight streaming through the window caught her profile at the exact angle Harper used to tilt her head when she was taking selfies. My brain betrayed me. For one blinding, disorienting second, my body remembered the girl who had broken my heart before my rational mind could correct the error. My stomach locked into a tight knot. The familiar, sickening wave of adrenaline rushed into my bloodstream, making my hands go cold. Madison noticed. Of course she did. Her observation skills were terrifyingly sharp. She felt my sudden stillness. She turned the faucet off, set the colander down on the marble counter, and carefully dried her hands on a towel. She didn't step toward me. She didn't demand to know what was wrong. She deliberately took a half step back, creating a physical buffer between us. "Too much?" she asked quietly, her voice low and steady. I closed my eyes, hating the flush of shame that burned my cheeks. "Not you," I whispered, rubbing my temples. "Still too much. Sometimes your face arrives before you do." She absorbed that with a slow, barely perceptible nod. There was no wounded theatrics. There was no offense taken. There was only the difficult, profound mercy of a woman who completely understood what caused the harm and knew exactly how not to trigger it. I looked at her across the small expanse of my kitchen, this brilliant, intimidating woman who shared a face with the person who had made me distrust my own reality, and felt a wave of profound gratitude. "Say something Harper would never say," I challenged softly, needing her to ground me in the present. Madison considered this for a moment. Her blue eyes sparkled with a sudden, dry wit. "I alphabetized your spice rack on Wednesday while you were in the shower, and I have been living with the guilt ever since." A loud, ungraceful laugh burst out of my chest, so abruptly that Barnaby scrambled off the sofa and fled the room. Madison's mouth softened into a genuine, breathtaking smile. "Better? You monster." Cumin was sitting between the nutmeg and the chili flakes, Chloe. There are limits to my endurance. After that, it became our strange, private ritual. When memory confused the two of them, Madison gave me a difference. Harper would never admit she was wrong about navigation, then sulk in the passenger seat. Madison simply accepted my directions. Harper would never spend 40 minutes learning exactly how I liked my specialized design pens cleaned because they mattered to me. Madison learned the brand names. Harper would never ask, "May I come closer?" in a quiet hallway where no one else could hear. The absolute depth of those differences became undeniably clear the week a brutal winter flu swept through the city and knocked me entirely off my feet. I had tried to hide it, stubbornly insisting it was just allergies caused by the dry radiator heat. But by Tuesday evening, I was shivering uncontrollably under 3 heavy blankets, my throat feeling like it was lined with shattered glass. I was too weak to even be embarrassed when Madison appeared in my doorway with a bag from the pharmacy, a container of bone broth, and a look that clearly communicated she had already won whatever argument I was planning to start. I tried to refuse the digital thermometer out of pure, feverish principle. She stood beside my bed, holding it out, waiting with endless patience. I lasted exactly 12 seconds before opening my mouth. "You just enjoy being right," I muttered, my voice hoarse and completely lacking authority. "No," Madison replied, checking the glowing red numbers on the display with a slight frown. "I enjoy accurate information. Being right is merely a recurring side effect." "That is the most Madison Sterling sentence ever spoken," I grumbled, pulling the blanket up to my chin. She placed a cool, damp cloth across my burning forehead. Her long fingers lightly brushed my temple, lingering just for a moment when I subconsciously leaned into the touch. The room was dim, illuminated only by the streetlights outside. My pride had completely dissolved into the fever, leaving me raw and unguarded. She sat on the edge of my mattress with a quiet, steady patience that made my chest ache. I thought of all the times I had made myself small so Harper could be comfortable with my pain. Harper didn't like illness. She didn't like anything that required her to put someone else's needs above her own convenience. Harper needed my pain to be pretty, manageable, and out of sight. Madison didn't need my pain to be pretty. She only needed it named so she could treat it. I used to imagine someone taking care of me without making me feel like a burden, I said, my voice thick with sleep and fever, my eyes drifting shut. Her hands stilled against my forehead. Did you? Don't look so sad. I was dramatic even before the betrayal. I am not sad because you wanted care, Chloe, Madison said, her voice vibrating with a quiet, heartbreaking intensity. I am sad because it sounds like you had to rely on your imagination to get it. In the morning, my fever had broken, leaving me clear-headed enough to remember exactly what I had said in the dark. I wished briefly to evaporate into the mattress. But Madison walked in carrying a tray of perfect golden brown toast and pretended not to notice my burning embarrassment until I finally spoke. If you repeat anything Fever Chloe said last night, I will deny it with intense legal aggression, I threatened, sitting up against the pillows. Fever Chloe was highly articulate, Madison noted smoothly, setting the tray across my lap. And incredibly fond of being babied. You are impossible. Only selectively. She tapped the edge of the tray. Eat. Your dramatic constitution requires fuel. I ate the toast. It was toasted to the exact shade of golden brown that I preferred, a tiny, insignificant detail that she had learned simply by watching me in the kitchen, not by taking a calculated inventory of my weaknesses. By the end of the week, I was fully recovered, just in time for the Vanguard Foundation charity auction. Madison had invited me weeks ago, long before the confrontation in the lobby. She had been careful to specify that it wasn't a date. Saying the word date out loud still felt like carrying a lit match through a powder keg, but rather an invitation as the featured artist. My architectural and interior illustrations for the Haven Community Center were going to be displayed in the gallery portion of the event to help drive donations. Since the night Harper had invaded our building, everything between Madison and me felt newly exposed. It was like living in a house where all the curtains had been suddenly torn down, leaving us flooded with blinding, terrifying light. I spent 2 agonizing hours staring at my closet, trying to decide what to wear. When I was with Harper, I dressed to compliment her. If she wore bright colors, I wore muted tones so she could shine. Once, I had bought a stunning, deep emerald green silk dress for a New Year's Eve gala. Harper had taken one look at it and wrinkled her nose, telling me the color was too severe and made me look unapproachable. I had returned it the next day. I had bought the exact same dress 3 days ago. I slipped it on. The heavy emerald silk clung perfectly to my curves, falling elegantly to the floor with a dangerous thigh-high slit. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't soft. Severe, I decided as I applied a deep, dark red lipstick, was just another word for unwilling to be consumed. I wanted to look untouchable. I wanted to look like a woman who owned her own space. At exactly 7 o'clock, a soft knock echoed from my front door. I took a deep breath, grabbed my black clutch, and opened it. Madison was standing in the hallway, illuminated by the dim overhead fixture. She was wearing a custom-tailored midnight black velvet tuxedo jacket, a crisp black silk shirt unbuttoned perfectly at the collar, and matching trousers that made her look devastatingly tall. When the door opened and she saw me, she completely forgot to hide. It was the only way to describe it. The formidable, untouchable CEO vanished. Her gaze traveled from my pinned-up hair down the sweeping lines of the emerald silk, to the slit at my thigh and back up to my dark red mouth. For one completely unguarded, breathless second, the raw hunger in her eyes was so intense it made my knees weak. You look, Madison started, her voice sounding unusually rough. She stopped, seemingly incapable of finding the right word. Choose wisely, I teased, though my heart was hammering violently against my ribs. Madison stepped closer, the scent of cedar and night air wrapping around me. Her eyes locked onto mine, burning with a quiet, undeniable reverence. "Impossible to ignore," she finally whispered. "It was better than beautiful." Beautiful was passive. Beautiful was something to be looked at. Impossible to ignore felt like a weapon being placed gently back into my hands. End of Part 7. Part 8, The Shape of a Name. The Vanguard Foundation charity auction was held in a massive, converted bank downtown. The architecture was stunning, soaring marble columns, vaulted ceilings, and enormous arched windows that looked out over the glittering city skyline. The room was bathed in the warm, flickering glow of hundreds of candles arranged on long banquet tables, reflecting off crystal chandeliers and the expensive jewelry of the city's elite. It was a room filled with people who treated generosity as a networking opportunity. My architectural illustrations were displayed prominently along the east wall, beautifully mounted on dark wooden easels. They were warm, detailed renderings of the redesigned Haven Community Center, the soft lighting of the counseling rooms, the curved, protective edges of the children's play areas, the rich terracotta and sage colors that signaled safety. I had drawn spaces designed for people who desperately needed to feel like they weren't temporary. Standing there in my emerald dress, holding a flute of champagne while wealthy strangers leaned close to study the details of my work, I felt a profound sense of grounding. For the first time in a very long time, I felt like a solid, complete person. Madison was a completely different entity in public. She wasn't colder exactly, but she was entirely armored. When people approached her, and they did, constantly with careful, deferential smiles, she answered with a calm, absolute authority that commanded the entire room without raising her voice. She navigated the shark-infested waters of the city's elite with effortless grace. But what struck me most was how she introduced me. She didn't introduce me as a friend. She didn't introduce me as her neighbor. She certainly didn't introduce me as anyone connected to her family name. She placed a light, respectful hand on the small of my back and introduced me as Chloe Evans, the visionary artist whose work understood dignity as architecture. She spoke about my designs with such genuine, unwavering respect that I had to look away a few times. Praise from Madison Sterling didn't slide off. It entered your bones. Halfway through the evening, I needed a moment to breathe. Crowd was overwhelming. I slipped away from the main floor, wandering down a quieter hallway lined with smaller art pieces up for auction. I was standing in front of a particularly striking abstract painting when I heard the sharp, rhythmic click of heels approaching. I turned. It was Zoe. She looked entirely out of place in the opulent setting, wearing a simple black dress that seemed to shrink around her. She didn't have a glass of champagne. She looked exhausted, the dark circles under her eyes visible even in the dim lighting of the corridor. My first instinct was to turn and walk away. I had nothing left to say to the girl who had traded 12 years of friendship for a moment in the spotlight. But something in her posture, the nervous wringing of her hands, the way she refused to meet my eyes, made me stop. "Harper isn't here," Zoe said quickly, her voice small. I came alone. I bought a general admission ticket. I crossed my arms, the emerald silk rustling softly. "Why are you here, Zoe?" She finally looked up at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and the defiance she had worn like armor at my birthday party was completely gone. "I saw your drawings in the main hall," she whispered. "They're beautiful, Chloe. They look like the way you used to make my apartment feel when we were in college." A sharp pang of nostalgia hit me, quickly buried by the cold reality of the present. "Don't do that," I warned quietly. "Don't try to use our history to make yourself feel better." Zoe flinched. She looked down at her hands. "I'm leaving her. Or she's leaving me. I don't really know anymore." I keep saying it out loud, hoping one of the versions becomes true. I didn't feel a rush of vindictive pleasure. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt a profound, heavy sadness for the girl I used to know. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and to my surprise, I meant it. "I was so jealous of you for years," Zoe blurted out, the words spilling over each other as if she had been holding them in for a decade. Not just because Harper loved you or pretended to. I was jealous because people softened around you. 'Cause you could walk into a cheap, empty room and make it feel like somewhere worth staying. I wanted that. I wanted to be near it. And then, I wanted to own it. And then I hated you for having it at all. Her honesty was raw, ugly, and devastating. But it didn't hook into my chest the way her excuses had 8 months ago. It just washed over me. You could have just told me you were lonely, Zoe, I said softly. I know, a tear slipped down her cheek. I chose worse. For a long moment, we stood in the quiet hallway, two survivors of a hurricane comparing the wreckage. There was no grand forgiveness. There was no tearful embrace. There was just the quiet acknowledgement of a bridge that had burned down completely. Zoe wiped her face, taking a step back. Madison loves you, you know. My breath caught sharply in my throat. My heart gave a violent, involuntary jolt. That is not yours to tell me, I said, my voice hardening instantly. I know, Zoe offered a sad, broken smile. I'm sorry. Old habits. Still taking things that don't belong to me. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd near the cloakroom. I watched her go, feeling the first dull edge of true closure settle into my chest. I didn't hate her anymore. I just didn't need her. I stood in the hallway for a few minutes, trying to steady my racing pulse. Madison loves you. The words echoed in my mind, terrifying and brilliant. When I finally walked back into the main hall, the auction was in full swing. Madison was standing near my display, speaking with a wealthy couple I recognized from the society pages. When she saw me approaching, she smoothly excused herself, her eyes tracking my movement with that intense, unwavering focus. She met me halfway across the floor. Are you all right? She asked immediately, noting the slight flush in my cheeks. I saw Zoe walking toward the exit. I'm fine, I said, taking a deep breath. The scent of her expensive cologne and the warm wax of the candles enveloped me. She said something to me. Madison's jaw tightened. If she upset you, I will have security ensure she never steps foot in this building again. No, she didn't upset me. Not like that. I looked up into Madison's eyes. The room around us was glittering with money, noise, and light, but right then it felt like we were the only two people in the building. She told me something that belongs to you. Madison went perfectly still. The formidable CEO vanished completely. She didn't pretend not to understand. She didn't deflect. That was one of the things I loved most about her. She refused to cheapen serious questions with false confusion. Did she? Madison asked, her voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur that vibrated in the space between us. Yes. I held her gaze, my heart pounding so hard I was certain it was visible against the silk of my dress. Do you? Madison didn't look away. Her eyes, usually so guarded, were entirely open. Yes, she said softly, but the word carried the weight of an absolute truth. I love you, Chloe. I have been trying very hard not to make that your burden. I have been failing privately for months. The words weren't wrapped in dramatic flair. They weren't used as leverage. They were simply placed gently into my hands, an offering without an expectation. My first instinct was fear, a phantom alarm triggered by a face that looked so much like the one that had destroyed me. But the fear lasted only a fraction of a second. It was immediately swallowed by a tenderness so fierce, so overwhelming that I physically swayed toward her. I don't want to be loved as penance, I whispered, the noise of the auction fading away entirely. You are not, Madison replied instantly. Or because I'm damaged. You are not damaged, she said fiercely, stepping closer, though she kept her hands firmly at her sides, offering me every possible exit. You are what remained generous after damage tried to make you small. I love you because you are brilliant, because you are kind, because you fight for the things that matter. I breathed in the air between us. I thought about the broken X-Acto knife. I thought about the chamomile tea. I thought about the way she had stood beside me in the lobby, defending my name without asking for gratitude. I remembered Harper telling her she collected broken things, and I finally understood the profound difference. Being held was not the same as being collected. Being known was not the same as being used. "I love you too," I said. My voice trembled, not from fear, but because truth is not always steady the first time it learns to walk. Madison closed her eyes for one brief, agonizing second. When she opened them, the cold reputation she wore for the rest of the world was entirely gone. There was only a woman standing in a room full of witnesses, looking at me as if my answer had fundamentally altered the gravity of the earth. "May I kiss you?" she asked, her voice rough with restraint. I smiled, a real blinding smile. "'Cause of course," she asked. "'Cause the asking was the exact reason I could say yes." "Yes," I breathed. Madison closed the distance. Her hands found my waist, pulling me gently against the velvet of her tuxedo jacket. The kiss was soft at first, incredibly careful, as if she were testing the structural integrity of a delicate bridge. But the moment my hands reached up to grip the lapels of her jacket, Madison made a quiet, desperate sound against my mouth. The restraint vanished. She kissed me with a hunger that matched my own, a deep, consuming heat that chased away every lingering shadow of the past 8 months. The auction continued around us. Glasses chimed. People whispered. I didn't care. For the first time in my life, being seen didn't feel like a threat. It felt like coming home. End of Part 8. Part 9, The Architecture of Us. Transition from surviving a crisis to navigating ordinary happiness is terrifying. We knew how to weather storms. We had mastered the art of holding the roof up while the walls shook. But the quiet, sunlit mornings that followed the charity auction required a completely different kind of vulnerability. The first few weeks were tender in a way that made both of us beautifully, maddeningly awkward. Madison would kiss me goodbye in the morning before leaving for the Vanguard offices, and then step back with a startled expression, as if genuine affection had somehow slipped past her internal security detail. She wasn't used to being soft. I wasn't used to being safe. I bought 2 new electric toothbrushes for my bathroom. I spent 10 agonizing minutes staring at them on the porcelain sink, wondering if leaving the sleek black one next to my white one was too presumptuous. When Madison came over that evening, she walked into the bathroom, stared at the counter for a long moment, and then picked up the black toothbrush. She walked back into the living room, holding it up with the solemn gravity of a judge presenting evidence. "Is this an invitation, Chloe, or a logistical storage error?" she asked, her blue eyes scanning my face for a trap. "It's a diplomatic gesture," I replied, trying to suppress a smile. Madison didn't laugh, but the tension melted from her shoulders. She carried it back into the bathroom and placed it precisely a 1/4 inch from mine. Later that night, I caught her smiling at the sink, as if basic dental hygiene had suddenly become profound poetry. But I want to be honest about this part of the story because people love to polish the beginnings of love until no fingerprints remain. We were not a fairy tale. We were 2 complicated women with heavy histories, and we fought. Madison still had a deeply ingrained instinct to solve problems before I had even finished feeling them. I still had a habit of hearing control where she meant care. Collision of those 2 traumas was inevitable. It happened on a cold Tuesday in late January. I checked my email while drinking my morning coffee and found a PDF attachment from a high-powered legal firm representing the Sterling family estate. It was a thinly veiled cease and desist letter. The document, wrapped in dense legalese, essentially implied that my successful pitch for the Haven Community Center was secured using Sterling family contacts, and demanded that I publicly credit their network or face a potential lawsuit for reputational leverage. It was utterly ridiculous. It was baseless. But as I stared at the aggressive legal letterhead, the familiar, suffocating panic began to rise in my chest. This was Harper. This was Harper realizing she had lost her grip on me and using her family's immense wealth to try and force me back into a corner. Before I could even process my anger, a second email popped into my inbox. It was from the lead counsel at Vanguard Capital, Madison's firm. The email was a copy of a devastatingly aggressive countersuit threat, already sent to Harper's lawyers, explicitly stating that Vanguard would financially ruin the Sterling estate if they ever contacted me again. I stared at the screen, the panic instantly evaporating, replaced by a hot, blinding flash of fury. I marched across the hallway, pushing through Madison's unlocked door. She was standing in her kitchen, dressed in her signature tailored trousers and a silk blouse, reviewing a quarterly report on her tablet. "You cannot mobilize a legal cavalry without asking me," I said, my voice echoing loudly against the marble countertops. Madison looked up, her expression instantly shifting into a guarded, defensive mask. She set the tablet down. "You saw the email from my legal team." "Yes, I did. Right after I saw the ridiculous threat from Harper's lawyers." I crossed my arms, my heart pounding. "Madison, this is my business. This is my reputation. You can't just unleash your corporate lawyers on my problems without consulting me." "I was trying to prevent damage," Madison said smoothly, slipping into her CEO cadence. "That letter was designed to intimidate you. It is a baseless, predatory tactic, and I dealt with it efficiently." "I know what it was," I shot back, stepping closer. "And I am telling you that being protected without being consulted feels entirely too much like being managed." The word managed hit her like a physical blow. The impenetrable armor she wore for the boardroom cracked. She looked down at the marble island, the muscles in her jaw working furiously as she fought against her own defensive instincts. The old Madison, the one I had met months ago, would have retreated into cold formality. This Madison took a deep, shaky breath, looked me directly in the eyes, and chose the truth over her pride. "You are right," she said quietly. The admission seemed to physically pain her. I panicked. I blinked, my anger faltering. "You?" "Panicked?" "Yes." She ran a hand through her perfectly styled hair, ruining it slightly. "I know the man who drafted that letter for Harper. He is a shark. He does not stop unless he is shown a bigger predator. When I found out they were targeting you, I imagined you sitting in your apartment, opening that email alone. I imagined you thinking, even for a brief second, that their twisted version of your success might become public record." Her voice dropped, the fierce, protective undercurrent vibrating in the quiet kitchen. "I imagined you feeling small again. And the thought of it made me so angry I couldn't breathe." The remaining heat in my chest dissolved into something entirely different. Dissolved into a heavy, aching tenderness. She hadn't acted out of a need to control me. She had acted out of a desperate, terrifying need to shield me from the very people who had taught her how to be cold in the first place. "You still have to ask," I said softly, stepping around the island. "I know. Even when you're scared." "Especially then," Madison murmured, closing the final inch between us and resting her forehead against mine. I breathed in the scent of cedar and expensive coffee, letting the steady beat of her heart ground me. We drafted a new response together. Not with Vanguard's corporate letterhead, and not with threats of financial ruin, but with my own freelance studio's branding. It was a precise, airtight document, backed by dates, contracts, and a final paragraph that I typed myself. My work, my name, and my history are not available for further Sterling family revision. Madison read it over my shoulder, resting her chin on my collarbone. "What?" I asked, turning my head to catch the look of quiet wonder in her eyes. "Nothing," she smiled, pressing a soft kiss to my neck. "I just really love watching you refuse to disappear." That became the new foundation of our intimacy. It wasn't about rescue, it was about witness. Love did not magically make us fearless. Love just made the fear less solitary. The resemblance to Harper, which used to stop my heart, slowly lost its power. If Madison turned too quickly and I saw a flash of her twin, Madison never punished me for the flinch. She learned to announce herself from doorways, to touch my wrist before my waist, to let the ghosts exist without treating them as rivals. In return, I learned that loving Madison didn't erase what Harper had done, but it fundamentally changed the architecture of the room where the memory lived. It no longer occupied the center stage. The final test of that new architecture came in early spring. I was walking through the lobby of our building, carrying a portfolio of completed designs, when the heavy glass doors slid open. The sudden chill of the March wind swept into the warm lobby. Harper walked in. She looked different. The arrogant, untouchable glow that usually surrounded her had dimmed. She was wearing a trench coat, and her hands were clutching a large bouquet of white ranunculus and pale blue hydrangeas, the exact same flowers I had arranged for Zoe's studio opening the night my world had collapsed. My feet stopped moving, but my heart didn't race. The adrenaline didn't spike. I looked at the woman who had caused me so much agony, and I felt with absolute stunning clarity nothing. There was no residual pain. There was no lingering hatred. There was just a mild sense of inconvenience, like finding a pothole on a familiar road. "Chloe," Harper said, her voice attempting that soft, tragic pitch she used to use to manipulate me. "Please. Just give me 5 minutes." She held the bouquet forward like a shield. "I miss you. I miss who we used to be." Zoe left. "Everything is a mess, and I keep thinking about how safe you made me feel." I looked at the white petals. I remembered crouching on the marble floor, picking up the shattered pieces of the vase, bleeding while Harper watched. "You don't miss me, Harper," I said, my voice completely steady. The acoustics of the lobby carried the words clearly. "You miss who I was for you. You miss having a designated place to dump your guilt. But I don't live there anymore." Harper's face crumpled slightly. "I can change. I can be better." "I sincerely hope you figure out how to do that," I replied gently, shifting my portfolio to my other arm. "But you are going to have to do it far away from me." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the elevator doors slide open. Madison stepped out. She was wearing a sharp gray suit, her presence immediately demanding the air in the room. But she didn't march over. She didn't put herself between Harper and me like a bodyguard. Madison stopped by the elevator bank. She put her hands in her pockets and simply waited. She watched me hold my ground, offering me the quiet, absolute respect of letting me fight my own battle. Harper looked at me, then looked past me at her twin sister. The reality of the situation finally seemed to land. She couldn't break this. She couldn't manipulate her way back into a house that had been entirely rebuilt with stronger materials. Without another word, Harper turned around, walked out the glass doors, and dropped the bouquet of ranunculus into the trash can on the corner. I let out a long, slow breath. The ghost was finally gone. I turned and walked toward the elevators. Madison took her hands out of her pockets. She didn't say "I told you so." She didn't ask if I was okay. She simply held out her hand, not claiming me, but asking. I slipped my hand into hers, our fingers locking together, and let her lead me home. End of Part 9. Part 10, The Architecture of Us. Exactly 1 year after Madison Sterling moved into Unit 3B, bringing a thunderstorm of complicated grief and expensive cedar perfume into my life, we decided to alter the floor plan. We didn't tear down the entire wall between our apartments. We hired a contractor to carefully demolish a 10-foot section of the drywall separating our living rooms, framing it out into a wide, elegant archway lined with dark walnut wood. We deliberately kept both of our front doors. We kept both of our kitchens, though we only ever cooked in hers because my oven was entirely unpredictable. We both understood the profound psychological value of having a space that belonged solely to you. We didn't want to merge our lives into an unrecognizable, codependent blur. We wanted to be two complete, independent women who consciously chose to bridge the gap every single day. The archway became the physical manifestation of that choice. It was wide enough for the afternoon sunlight from her massive windows to spill perfectly into my chaotic studio space, and wide enough for Barnaby to march through with the imperial satisfaction of a conquering king whose territory had just doubled in size. Our shared space became a beautiful contradiction. On my side of the archway, there were stacks of canvas, colorful drafting tools, thrifted ceramics, and the chaotic hum of a freelance artist's mind at work. On Madison's side, the world was sleek, minimalist, and deeply ordered. Dark leather, polished marble, and the massive, imposing presence of her black Steinway piano. Madison had started playing her own compositions again. It didn't happen overnight. For the first few months, she would only play when she thought I was out of the apartment, the muffled, tentative notes bleeding through the walls. But slowly, as the foundation of our trust settled into the floorboards, she stopped hiding it. I would sit at my drafting table, working on a new commission, and listen to the CEO of Vanguard Capital pour her soul into the ivory keys. Her music was breathtaking. It was complex, sweeping, and saturated with a fierce, brilliant emotion that she kept carefully concealed from the rest of the world. Sometimes she would stop mid-measure, let her hands rest on the keys, and look through the archway at me. I would lower my digital pen and meet her gaze. In those quiet, suspended moments, surrounded by the music she had finally given herself permission to write, she looked at me with an astonishment that suggested love still surprised her by deciding to stay. In late October, the Haven Community Center officially opened its doors to the public. It was a triumph. The women's shelter was no longer a cold, institutional building filled with harsh fluorescent lights and sterile white walls. It was a sanctuary. Walking through the front doors felt like exhaling a breath you didn't know you were holding. My terracotta and sage color palettes warmed the spaces, the curved architectural lines provided subconscious comfort, and the hidden safety features allowed the residents to finally lower their guards. The opening gala was completely different from the Vanguard charity auction. There were no billionaires sipping champagne while looking for tax write-offs. It was a celebration of the community, filled with the women who would actually be using the center, local social workers, and the construction teams who had brought my visions to life. I stood in the center of the main atrium, wearing a sharp, tailored maroon suit that I had bought specifically for the occasion, feeling entirely anchored in my own skin. Madison stood a few feet away, leaning against a warm terracotta pillar, watching me. She was wearing a charcoal gray three-piece suit that made her look impossibly formidable, but the expression on her face was entirely soft. She wasn't managing the room. She wasn't networking. She was simply observing the woman she loved stand in the center of an accomplishment that couldn't be taken away or minimized. When the speeches were over, she walked over to me, handing me a small paper cup of terrible, lukewarm fruit punch from the refreshment table. I tried to find champagne, but apparently community centers run on high-fructose corn syrup and sheer willpower, Madison noted dryly, clinking her paper cup against mine. It's the nectar of the gods, I laughed, taking a sip and immediately wincing at the artificial sweetness. I looked around the atrium, the pride swelling in my chest until it physically ached. We actually did it, Madison. It's real. You did it, Chloe, she corrected gently. She reached out, her cool fingers brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. I just made sure the men in the suits didn't get in your way. The warmth in this building? That is entirely you. Her praise still had the power to stop my breath. I leaned into her touch, ignoring the crowded room. I couldn't have done it if you hadn't cleared the room for me. I will always clear the room for you, Madison said, her voice dropping into that dark, private register reserved exclusively for me. For the rest of my life. By the time the first heavy snow of winter blanketed the city in December, the lingering ghosts of the past had finally packed their bags and left for good. We were spending a quiet Friday evening on her side of the archway. The city outside was a swirling vortex of white, the wind howling against the thick glass of the windows, muffling the usual sounds of traffic. Inside, the apartment was a sanctuary of heat and light. We had lit the gas fireplace, casting long, dancing golden shadows across the dark hardwood floors. We were sitting on a thick, plush rug in front of the hearth. I was wearing one of Madison's oversized cashmere sweaters, which swallowed me entirely, and she was wearing a pair of my absurd, brightly colored wool socks that I had forced upon her feet because she was perpetually cold. Barnaby was fast asleep between us, his chin resting possessively on Madison's knee. On the sleek side table next to the piano, a framed photograph was displayed. It hadn't been there when I first met her. For months, it had been kept face down in a drawer. It was a picture of two little girls, identical twins at perhaps 8 years old, standing in a manicured garden. One girl was laughing directly into the camera, demanding the spotlight. The other girl was standing slightly to the side, watching her sister with quiet, analytical eyes. I no longer felt a spike of panic when I looked at the laughing girl. I no longer hated Harper. That, perhaps more than anything else, was the absolute proof of my healing. Hating her would have required carrying her with me. I had finally put her down. Madison shifted, pulling my legs across her lap. She took my right hand in hers, her thumb lightly tracing the faint silvery scar on my palm from the X-Acto knife accident. "Do you ever wonder," Madison murmured, her eyes tracing the line of the scar, "whether we found each other in the most catastrophic way possible?" The firelight flickered across her face, highlighting the sharp angle of her jaw and the deep ocean blue of her eyes. "Yes," I answered honestly. My hand relaxed in her grip. I think the doorway we walked through was a complete disaster. I leaned my head back against the edge of the leather sofa, looking at the snow pressing against the glass. But I don't think the doorway matters as much as the house you build once you're inside. Madison's hands stilled. She looked at me, a profound, heavy emotion shifting in her gaze. "You have a remarkable talent for making broken things sound entirely reparable." Occupational hazard, Madison. I fix empty rooms for a living. The way she looked at me then, it wasn't just love. It was a deep, unshakable reverence. She brought my scarred hand to her lips, pressing a soft, warm kiss directly against the healed skin. "Thank you," she whispered against my palm. "For what?" "For not making me pay for my sister's sins," Madison said, her voice rough with a vulnerability she trusted me enough to show. "For seeing the difference. For letting me be myself, even when my face terrified you." I shifted on the rug, closing the distance between us until our shoulders were pressed together. I reached up, cupping her cheek, feeling the steady, reassuring pulse at her jawline. I traced the faint scar near her eyebrow, the tiny detail that belonged only to her, the map to the woman who had anchored me when the world was spinning. "Thank you for not making me feel like a project," I replied softly. "Thank you for knowing every terrible, messy secret I never wanted to say out loud, and choosing not to use them as weapons." Madison didn't reply with words. She leaned in, capturing my mouth with a slow, devastating kiss that tasted like expensive wine and absolute certainty. The heat of the fire wrapped around us, a stark contrast to the freezing storm outside. I tangled my fingers in her dark hair, pulling her closer, feeling the solid, unyielding reality of her presence. Once I had believed that secrets were safest when swallowed. Once I had loved a woman who treated my private vulnerabilities like proof of ownership, a currency to be traded for control. But the woman holding me now had learned my silences without stealing them. She had known the darkest parts of my grief, and instead of using them to make herself feel powerful, she had handed them back to me with gentler names. Loyal, brilliant, fierce, worth staying for. Outside, the winter storm raged, burying the city in ice and snow. But inside, the fire burned steadily, the piano waited in the corner to be played, and the hallway that had once been a battleground was now just an open archway, bathed in light. We hadn't just survived the wreckage. We had cleared the debris, drawn a new blueprint, and built a home. End of part 10. Wow, take a deep breath with me, everyone. What a journey that was. We have finally reached the end of Chloe and Madison's story, and honestly, my heart is so incredibly full right now. First of all, I just want to say a massive, heartfelt thank you to every single one of you for staying with me until the very end. If you've made it this far, you are the true soul of this channel, and I appreciate you more than words can say. Let's just take a moment to really unpack what we just experienced because there is so much to talk about here. This wasn't just a romance. It was a story about reclaiming your own space after someone else tore it down. We see such a beautiful, heartbreaking contrast between the twins. Harper represented that toxic, all-consuming kind of love, the kind that takes your secrets, your fears, and your vulnerabilities and weaponizes them just to keep you small. She wanted to collect Chloe. But then we have Madison. Oh, Madison. She came in with that icy CEO exterior, but underneath it, she was the ultimate protector. She didn't want to collect Chloe, she wanted to witness her. She didn't want to fix her, she wanted to stand beside her and clear the room so Chloe could fix herself. I think my absolute favorite theme in this story is the architecture of it all. Started with an invisible line in a hallway, turned into two open doors, and eventually became a beautiful shared archway where they still kept their own individual spaces. Such a powerful reminder that true, healthy love doesn't mean losing your identity or merging into one person. It means building a house together where both of you have the space to breathe and be yourselves. But enough of my rambling, I want to hear from you. Let's get a conversation going down in the comments. I have a few questions for you all. First, have you ever dealt with a Harper in your own life? Someone who made you feel like you had to shrink yourself or put away the things you love just to be accepted? Second, what was your absolute favorite Madison moment? Was it her patching up Chloe's hand in the kitchen with that intense eye contact? Or was it the way she completely dismantled that arrogant developer in the boardroom? Let me know because I honestly can't choose. And finally, the biggest question. Do you think you could ever fall for someone who shared the exact same face as the person who broke your heart? That is a wild psychological hurdle, and I'd love to know if you think you could do it like Chloe did. If this story made you feel something, if it made your heart race or gave you butterflies or just made you smile, please do me a huge favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and tells the algorithm that we are building an amazing community here. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to your GL girlfriend. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. I have so many more beautiful, intense, and romantic GL stories coming your way, and I want you right here with me for all of them. Thank you again for listening, for feeling, and for being such a wonderful audience. Grab a warm cup of chamomile tea, take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next video. Bye, loves.